All right, listeners, today's episode is a mind-blowing one. A truly mind-blowing conversation with someone, and I do not use that phrase lightly. It has melted my face. It has blown my mind so much. It's with Dr. Donald Hoffman, who is a professor of cognitive sciences at UC Irvine. And what started with a TED Talk that I randomly came across a few months ago that he did in 2015 that essentially says that his mathematical models, him and his team, have proven out that the chances that we see reality is 0%. There is 0% chance that we see what's actually going on. That TED Talk was recorded in 2015. I just went video after video seeing what then his implications in 2016 said, in 2017, and 2018, and it got stranger and stranger, but all based on their very quantifiable mathematical models and hypotheses turning into scientific theorems. This is not just conjecture or philosophical musings. It is far more rigorously tested than that. We talk about the different viewpoints on the world. We talk about the different camps of, is the world material and physical? And we talk about emergence of consciousness. We talk about the differences of his viewpoints to non-dualism, and we give the backstory of each of these. It is something that you would think would be over your head, and yet he explains it with such great plain English analogies that it's not only really fun to follow along, but like I said, you get to the end of the episode, and at least I got to the end of the conversation and felt like, oh my God, I'm starting from scratch. From everything that I thought we knew. It really is, I'm not getting hyperbolic, it really is that type of conversation. So without further ado, let's get into it with Dr. Donald Hoffman. This is Below the Line. All right, Dr. Hoffman, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, James. It's a great pleasure, and thanks for the invitation.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I have been for weeks. I have just eaten up your book, Case Against Reality, and I know you've written a couple, but that one is the one that I said I've got to complete before the interview. And this really starts from a TED Talk you gave 5 years ago, and I only saw it maybe 5 months ago, and it just completely blew my mind. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. But that's maybe a 15-minute talk compared to what we're going to chat about here. I'd love to kick off the conversation with just essentially the big question of, in starting pretty early, where did your hypothesis around reality, where did it start years ago, and how has it evolved to today, and how would you articulate it to today, someone you're meeting for the first time?
Well, it's been a long personal evolution, because the idea is pretty crazy that we don't see reality as it is. And so I didn't just come to it, immediately. It was a long personal evolution. I grew up in a mixed background where my parents had degrees in science. My dad had a master's degree in chemistry, my mom in biology. So I had, a good science background, from them in my growing up. But they were also religious fundamentalists. And so I got this Christian fundamentalist point of view. And I immediately, as a teenager, saw that there was a serious tension between those 2 points of view.
Right.
And it made me begin to wonder how to resolve that tension, because there were some claims that the fundamentalists were making that were just clearly contradicted by the science, like the Earth is only 6,000 years old and things like that, and the reliance on just faith and in spite of the facts sometimes kind of attitude. So I needed to work things out for myself, and I got the question: what does it mean to be human? What are we? Are we machines, or are we something more than just machines? It seemed to me at the time as a teenager that the science point of view seemed to be indicating that we were just complicated machines. And the religious point of view seemed to be saying that there's more to us than just machines, space, time, and matter. And so I decided that I really wanted to study that. And so I studied, as an undergraduate at UCLA, I studied psychology. It was quantitative psychology. It was a mathematical psychology. So it was like a minor in math, minor in computer science, a major in psychology. You can see I was trying to get some insight into human nature from the psychology, but some rigor from the computer science and the math side. And there, I was very lucky. I ran across the work of Professor David Marr, who was a professor at MIT, and his work on visual perception and artificial intelligence. So he was doing state-of-the-art work at the time where he understood the neuroscience. He had a PhD in neuroscience, but he was now trying to understand human vision and vision more generally from the point of view of artificial intelligence. How do you build an AI system that can see, a robotic system that can see? And that really seemed to me a great direction to go. It was rigorous. I could ask concrete questions of like, are we machines, by looking at a specific aspect of us, human visual perception, and really not wave my hands. I didn't want to wave my hands. I wanted to do something where I really got an answer. And this seemed to be a case where I could get an answer about how vision works by actually trying to build vision systems. So I was very fortunate. I got to go to MIT as a graduate student, and I was David Marr's student for less than 2 years, because he died.
Right, you talk about it in the book, right?
Yeah, it was tragic, but I fortunately got enough time to work with him, and he'd assembled a team around him with similar ideas. So and Whitman Richards, a professor was now the Brain and Cognitive Science department, was my advisor full time after Marr died.
And he was pretty renowned. Dr. Marr was pretty renowned, even in early 30s around the country, for you to pinpoint, okay, I want to work with him.
He was quite renowned. He had written several papers that grabbed me, because he wasn't just talking about vision with a hand wave and just doing his experiments are important, but he was doing more than just doing experiments about how vision might work. He was actually saying, here's a mathematical model about how we see in 3D. Let's write this model down and program it up in a computer and see if the computer can see in 3D. Now let's compare the computer's performance with human performance. That will be the acid test to see whether our model is anything like what's going on in the human brain. I thought, wow, if I want to see if humans are a machine or not, this is the way to do it. Let's build machines that mimic humans.
Really, so that the original fascination was around, are we machines? Are we something different? And
that's exactly right.
So it wasn't about reality. It wasn't yet, at least, and it wasn't necessarily about vision. It was, what are we? And can we take a career path to try to scratch at that itch and answer that question?
That was exactly it. I was really trying to figure out, what kind of creatures are we? But now the turn came was as I began to look at the mathematical models of perception that were coming out of this AI approach. It became clear that they all had a similar structure. So I began to wonder, could I get a general mathematical model of perception? And so I began to work on that. And when I came to UC Irvine, I got to work with a couple of mathematicians, Bruce Bennett and Chetan Prakash. And we worked for several years on a general mathematical model of perception. And it was then looking at that mathematical model that one day it hit me. Holy smoke, maybe we don't see reality as it is. Maybe.
Do you remember what that day was, or what around the year, month?
Yeah, it was around, I would say 1985, 1986 was when it hit me. It was in a conversation with my collaborators, Bruce Bennett and Chetan Prakash, and we were discussing.
And by the way, for listeners, if you hear a siren in the background, that isn't real. You're just perceiving that.
This is part of the whole COVID working from home thing. You get the blowers going. That's a blower going by my house.
Oh, it is? Okay. Exactly. See, the siren wasn't real. Completely made up in my mind.
We had to shoo off a bunch of crows that were that had just parked outside my window or were crowing away. So this is
real life. So we're going to take it all in. But yes, keep going. So it was about 1985 that you started to
Yes.
think, oh shit, we might not see.
We might not see reality as it is. And I still remember it hit me so hard that I had to actually sit down, because that idea had never seriously occurred to me. And I wasn't intending to go there. And I was just trying, innocently to get a general mathematical model of perception, because that just seemed like a good scientific thing to do. But the model came back and started to suggest to me that there was a serious possibility that we don't see reality as it is, that everything that we see is constructed. And I didn't see that it was necessarily the case that the constructions were tied to reality. I didn't see, by the way, necessarily the case that they're not tied to reality. I just saw that there was a possibility that they were disjointed.
Did that seem Galilean in a sense of, wait, the Earth might not, the sun might not be rotating around the Earth, and these initial observations suggest this might be either wildly different or I'm losing my mind a little bit.
Right. Well, and I think your analogy with Galileo is very good in the sense that Galileo really challenged a deeply held belief,
and a seemingly obvious one. Like obvious. Oh no, well, that is obvious. I see the sun moving around.
Yes.
It's got to be rotating around us.
Absolutely. And any fool could see that the Earth isn't moving. You could just look. I mean, look, it's not moving. And it's clear the sun and the moon, everything's going, it was just obvious. And so Galileo was challenging the obvious. And it also, I think, seems obvious to us that, of course, I look at the moon, that's because there really is a moon. And I'm seeing the truth. And I see the table and you see the table. We both agree that it's the simplest explanation is there really is a table. And we're just seeing the truth of it. Of course, no one thinks we see all of reality, but we see the parts that we need.
And for listeners, if your interest is piqued, we are going to get into the work that Dr. Hoffman's doing that would suggest that that moon that you see up there, that is obviously up there, might not be there. It might not be a representation of reality.
That's right. But it took me a while to get there in a way that I felt was compelling. So I wrote a book called Visual Intelligence, How We Create What We See, in 1998. And there I was already convinced now that our perceptions need not be tethered to reality. And I had studied some evolutionary theory, and I was beginning to think that evolution might not shape us to see reality as it is, but I hadn't worked out any arguments about that. So I just presented the basic ideas about perception of color and shape and motion and so forth, and show how we construct them, and argued that maybe our perceptions are just an interface. They're not a window on the truth. And the reception of that book was interesting. It was used as a textbook in various universities. It was well received, except for the last chapter where I suggest that we don't see reality. That I say maybe it's just user interface, and people say, great book, except for that last chapter where Hoffman goes off the rails and things sort of fall apart there. But if you skip the last chapter, it's a good book.
Do you mind building out more of what the nugget of the book where you're like, I need to write a book about this, premise, build out a little bit more about that interface concept?
Right. So what I argued there was that our senses, we tend to think of our senses as like a camera, and we're just taking a picture of the truth. And, it's a pretty faithful depiction. What you see, if I see, an apple sitting on the table, I'm not seeing all of reality, but it's a pretty faithful depiction of a real apple that would be there even if there were no creatures to perceive it, and a real table that would still be there, even if everybody on the planet died. And so what I argue is that point of view may not be right. It may be that our senses are more like a desktop interface on your computer. So if you're writing an email, all you see, and it would say the icon for your email is blue and rectangular in the middle of your desktop. That doesn't mean that the email itself is blue and rectangular in the middle of your laptop. Anybody who thought that would completely misunderstand the point of the desktop interface. It's not there to show you the truth, which would be the circuits and software, the voltages and magnetic fields in the computer. The interface is there to hide all of that really messy reality and give you simple eye candy, simple tools that let you control all the circuits and software without having to know anything about the details of it. And so,
that analogy couldn't become even more spot on with this conversation right now over Zoom.
right.
I am obviously, I'm perceiving that we're having this conversation. I'm getting towards what I ultimately want, which would be wisdom and conversation with you. But, and my brain is perceiving that, I'm moving towards that goal. But reality, I'm staring at a screen that is plasma.
That's right. Just pixels on a screen. And yet I infer, I think, honestly and accurately, something about what you're thinking, something about what you're feeling, again, whether you're interested or not. So we get some access to other people through this. But yeah, it's like instead of saying that space and time and physical objects are an objective reality and we're seeing them fairly truly, the idea was that, no, this is like a VR headset. So think of space-time as a virtual reality headset and physical objects as icons in that headset. But I didn't have any proof. There was no, all I could say was that everything we know about visual perception is compatible with that idea. It doesn't dismiss that idea, but I couldn't say that any of our best scientific theories entail that idea. And so I realized in like 2005, 2006, that if I wanted people to take this idea seriously, I needed to show that it was somehow entailed by our best theories. So I looked at evolution by natural selection. And I wondered, is it possible to show that natural selection itself would not favor organisms that see reality as it is, that they would in fact shape our senses. Natural selection would shape our senses to be more like a user interface. My intuition was that maybe I could show that because seeing reality is going to take too much time and too much energy. That was my intuition. And it turns out that that's true, but not terribly deep. But you have to start somewhere. And so I started with that idea. I got a couple of really good grad students, Brian Marion and Justin Mark, to start working with me around 2009. They wrote 100 simulations that did hundreds of thousands of games. It turns out that evolution by natural selection is a mathematically precise theory. There's something called evolutionary game theory. And so we can actually run simulations about natural selection to see what would happen. And I wanted to see if, as we played with the costs and so forth, that, the energy costs and so forth, the time costs for computing reality, that maybe reality wouldn't be favored by natural selection in terms of the sensory systems that evolved.
And what would be favored as the alternative?
More like a user interface, so that we would have natural selection would favor sensory systems of organisms that don't show reality, that just show you tricks and hacks about what you need to do. Just like the desktop interface, right? I have these little icons and little eye candy that gives me clever shortcuts that what I'm really doing is toggling voltages in the computer. That's what I'm really doing. Mm-hmm. But I have these little shortcuts that let me do that without knowing what I'm doing, right? That's the whole point of the interface. And so that was the idea, that evolution would give us these little bits of eye candy that we could act on that would then affect reality in the ways we needed to affect reality, but we wouldn't really know what we were doing. Mm-hmm. And so it was those simulations that showed, that's true, but the deeper idea that it hadn't occurred to me. And so it only came out of actually doing the hard work of running the simulations and looking at evolutionary theory very carefully, that we got the deeper idea, which is that the payoff functions that govern natural selection, and we can talk about payoff functions in a minute, but those payoff functions erase information about reality. So I'll unpack that a little bit, but that's going to be the bottom line. The payoff functions that drive evolution do not contain the information needed to see reality. So there's no way that natural selection could shape us or any organism's sensory systems of any kind. So not just vision, smell, touch, taste, any sensory system of any organism cannot be shaped by natural selection to show reality. And so the notion of a payoff function is a central notion in evolutionary game theory. So it's not too far afield to think about evolutionary game theory as like video games. So like in a video game, what you have to do is to focus on getting points as fast as you can without getting killed. And if you get enough points in the allotted time without getting killed, you get to go to the next level and keep going. And it's like that in evolution. You have to get fitness payoffs. And if you get enough fitness payoffs and avoid fitness harm, then you don't go to the next level of the game, but your genes go through your progeny, through your kids, into the next generation. And so it's just like in a video game. If you are dawdling around and doing anything but focusing on how to get points, you're going to lose. And it's the same thing in evolution. If your sensory systems do anything else but tell you how to behave to get fitness payoffs and how to avoid fitness harm, then you're going to die. You won't pass on your genes to the next generation, or at least your probabilities for that will go way down. So that's a key intuition. The fitness payoffs are going to drive what your sensory systems tell you, because they're going to be guiding your actions.
They're going to be guiding the prioritization of what you see. And it goes into one of the things that you write is 50% of our cortex is oriented for vision. When we open our eyes, you've got 50% of your neuronal cortex focused on vision, which is massive computational power, way more than any camera. If we were just taking a photo, we wouldn't need that computational power. But because we're not just taking a photo, but we're actually taking a photo, and I'm adding my own interpretation there, but it's almost like you're saying you're taking a photo and prioritizing everything you see, deprioritizing things, emphasizing certain things, worrying about certain things, not worrying about other things.
Yes. So I would say about 50% of your brain's cortex is involved in all the various kinds of sensory systems. Maybe a third of it's involved in vision, which is still, it's billions of neurons and trillions of synapses, right? It's an incredible amount of horsepower that seems to be involved when you just open your eyes and look around. And most of my colleagues in the neurosciences, cognitive neurosciences, assume that all that cortical hardware is working hard to give you a reconstruction of reality. So there's a real apple out there with red color and a particular shape, and all this neuronal hardware is needed to actually reconstruct, to recover the true 3D shape and color of that apple and other objects around. And what evolution is saying is absolutely not. I'll put it this way, if we assume that our sensory systems evolved and were shaped by natural selection,
which is a big key, it's kind of like, if we assume that.
Exactly. And as a scientist, we always have to say what theory we're assuming.
Right. And so we assume that, which is rigorously well understood, been beaten to hell. It's not the safest of assumptions, but it is a pretty safe one to say, okay, if we assume that.
That's right. And the reason I assume evolution by natural selection is not because I'm sure that theory is true, but I am sure that we have no better theory for understanding biology. And so as a scientist, I would be, it would be silly for me to use anything less than that tool to study this. And I think it would also be silly for me to assume that theory is the final word, right? I think none of our scientific theories are the final word, but we have to go with where we are.
Choose a canvas to paint on, and that's almost like the canvas that you start the argument with. So, and that's a very important. I'm calling that out for listeners because it's and within about 5 minutes, I don't know if this will make sense to you, but it'll certainly blow your mind within about 5 minutes, given just what I know of Dr. Hoffman's hypothesis. But that's a very important foundation of if we assume that we have evolved through natural selection, then ... your thinking goes on.
Yeah, then this follows. What follows is the probability is zero that any aspect of our perceptions tells us truths about the nature of objective reality, the structure of objective reality. The probability is precisely zero. And for people who are interested, I've worked with a mathematician. So what we did was we moved from the simulations. The simulations indicated that there was something interesting here. So then I went and did the real thing, which is to work with a mathematician and prove a theorem. So it's a theorem of evolution by natural selection that the probability is precisely zero, that the sensory system of any creature is giving truths about the structure of objective reality.
So the chances that apple is objectively there is 0%.
Exactly right. And the chance that the very language of space and time, of objects and colors within, of shapes within space and time, that very language could not possibly give a true description of objective reality. So I'm not saying that vision makes mistakes and we get the colors a little bit off or the shapes a little bit off or the distances and so forth. I'm saying it's not possible ever to give a true description of objective reality using the language of space and time and shapes and colors and so forth. It's the wrong language. Just to be very, very clear.
No, please go long form with these answers because it's going to set up the rest of the conversation.
Very, very good. Yeah. So if I ask you to, to give I'm teaching a computer science course, say, and I say to the students, I want you to give me a story about how a computer works. But the only language you can use is the language of pixels on your desktop. Well, good luck. That's the wrong language. You can't use the language of pixels to talk about the circuits and software and voltages and magnetic fields inside your computer. It's the wrong language. That's how deep this theorem is. It's saying the language of space and time and objects and colors, the language of our senses is the wrong language. It's trying to use pixels to describe computers. You can't do it. And so that's so I got more than I bargained for. I mean,
Right. Right. And I do want to ask a little bit about just your own internal journey within this. It sounds like from the outside and seeing in other interviews and reading the book that, am I getting it right that it was kind of gradual and it took a while to put these pieces together, even to come up with these analogies that go from wild claim to, oh, I do experience a version of that every day, or use the analogy of if you are in a VR set, your perception of it might be real. You perceive a steering wheel, or you're playing Grand Theft Auto. You perceive a steering wheel. You do turn this, or you perceive turning the steering wheel to the left. You are not turning a real steering wheel. That steering wheel isn't there, but there is a cause and effect that continues around this perceptual game of, oh, you turned it left and then the car went left. But the car isn't real. The steering wheel isn't real. You just perceive that it's real. And maybe that perception of the apple is real, but it is not objectively real.
Absolutely. I think that's a great analogy. And I think that for the younger generation that is spending a lot of time in virtual reality, and virtual realities that are getting more and more compelling, more and more immersive, it's not a big leap for that generation to take off their headset and go, what about this? Maybe this is also just a VR headset. I mean, whereas, for my generation, it was like a crazy idea. For someone that's going to spend a fair fraction of their day in VR realities that are quite immersive and compelling, it's not a big leap. It's just like it was a big leap in Galileo's time to think the Earth isn't the center of the universe. But for someone who's been in a rocket ship and gone to the moon and all of a sudden it's not a big leap anymore. It's sort of like duh. And I
Right.
think it's going to, so for our generation, this might be like, holy smoke, this is, you know, incredible stuff. But, I would guess in 20, 30 years, a generation that's been raised on VR is going to look back on us as like old Fuddy does, that why didn't they get it?
Well, and to your point, Gen Z has a phrase of "keep your third eye high," and it this, which is a Hindu concept of your third eye, your mind's eye. That is a very ancient concept, and yet they're using it so casually. Of there is more to perceive than just your two eyes visually. There is a higher perception of what's going on, or the concept of woke. I mean, that's pulled straight from had some in betweens, but pulled from a spiritual concept of awake from this dream state. This you are asleep. The
Yes.
and it's it's casually tossed around as if that is obvious, that people are sleeping, we need to wake up, or third eye high, or the VR set, the simulation. For listeners, I've wanted to talk about this for a while on the podcast, but I'll give the 2-minute. People have called in and asked if they think that if I think we're living in a simulation, and this is in the similar area code of what we're going to talk about. But Elon Musk, have you heard his argument that we are living in a simulation?
Yes.
It's very simple and brilliant. It's just, but it goes off of exactly what we're talking about. You use this technological framework that we're familiar with. Video games over the last 30 years. I'll do this in 30 seconds for people, then I'll shut up for you to talk. But his argument is, for the last 30 years, we've seen video games go from Pong and tiny little 2-bit representations of things to a VR headset that just in 30 years feels like you are in a brand new world with amazing graphical interfaces. Now imagine whether that's 100 years from now, continuing that, or 1,000 years from now, that it is seemingly inevitable we will have the computational power and the graphical interface power that we will develop a world 1,000 years from now. You can go, he's like, go to whatever degree you feel safe. 10,000 years from now, that you could recreate something that feels like real life with computational, exponential computational growth and just technological graphical interfaces. And he said, if that's the case, then it's only a matter of time. And then from there, the computational power will also allow for essentially infinite numbers of these. Maybe it's another 10,000 years, and it's not just 5 different worlds you can choose from, but from near infinite numbers. And therefore, there's going to be one base reality, an infinite number of virtual realities or simulated realities in the future. So what are the odds that we're living in right now, the base reality? Well, it's 1 in a billion. If there's going to be a billion, 20,000 years from now. So he's like, that's the odds. So he's like, the odds say that we're not living in a base reality. But it's similar to you. It becomes so easy with technological anchors in the argument. And I feel like like if you were to talk about what you're talking about in 1830, it wouldn't have these analogies. What would that even be like if you were to try to talk about this in 1775?
Well, I would probably be drawn and quartered, hanged for heresy, so burned at the stake. I mean, it would just be completely. Although there was Bishop Berkeley, so he was a bishop of the church, and he argued that we don't see reality as it is either. That when we see things, that they're only ideas in our minds, which is very similar to what I'm saying. Now he said that they're real because they are ideas in God's mind as well. So even if I'm not looking at the apple and having the apple in my mind, the apple is always in the mind of God. So it was a very similar idea to what I'm talking about. I mean, I'm not postulating, that God and the idea of an apple in the mind of God giving it the reality, but his idea that to exist, as Berkeley put it, to be is to be perceived or to be a perceiver. And that I agree with. I mean, so Berkeley did that, and he wasn't hung or burned at the stake. So maybe I should pull that back. Maybe He in fact was a bishop of the church. So maybe this idea would have been received. I think you have to be careful how you say it. I guess
Right.
that would be,
Right. And it might have taken another 10 years of finding a way to navigate it articulately.
right. If I think Bishop Barclay found a way to say it that kept him from being, taken to task by the church. He certainly, I think, wasn't well received by many scientists on that point of view. And so that's one reason why when I'm talking about this, I immediately go to this theorem from evolution by natural selection. Right? That changes the whole game here. It's one thing for me to say I think that our sensory systems don't show us reality as it is. There's no reason for me to be taken seriously if I just throw that out there. Interesting idea, so what? But when there's a theorem on the table, it's a very, very different game now. So it doesn't mean I'm right, but it does mean that if someone wants to dismiss it, they need to say what aspect of the theorem, what assumptions that went into the theorem do they disagree with, right? I mean, and
what are the critiques? What would you say the most paper thin, idiotic critiques are the ones that you just feel like are wafer thin? And then what are the big critiques that you'd say, yeah, that's a really good critique that you've gotten over the years?
Well, here one critique that is from a friend of mine who I highly respect, Rainer Mausfeld. He's a professor of psychology in Germany, brilliant thinker. And one thing that he pointed out was that here I'm making this claim that we don't see reality as it is based on evolution by natural selection. And he pointed out that there's a lot more to evolution than just natural selection, right? So there is genetic drift, there's linkage and pleiotropy, and the fact that there are constraints from chemistry and physics on how evolution can go. And there's a big debate in the theory of evolution, but evolution in general, Darwinian evolution, about how important natural selection is to the development of creatures, the evolution of species, and so forth.
I haven't heard that. What is the debate? Kind of the rough outline.
Well, so Stephen Jay Gould and Lewontin are two very, very famous. Gould is now dead, but very famous evolutionary theorists who suggest that there's very small role for natural selection. That other things like genetic drift and so forth are.
What is that?
So genetic drift just means that there are these random mutations of genes that really don't get selected pro or con, but they do change our functionality. And there's been a huge debate about whether that there's so much more genetic drift than selection. And there's a big debate as well about, clearly certain aspects of our biology are not selected for. For example, all of us have white bones. But is that because there were selection pressures for our bones to be white? No. There were selection pressures, presumably, for our bones to be strong and yet not brittle. And it turned out that calcium was a fairly good element to use in the construction of bones to get those properties of being strong but not brittle. And it turns out that calcium looks to us to be white. And so the whiteness of bones was not selected for. It was what they call a spandrel. It's sort of an accidental byproduct. Spandrels in architecture are, features of an arch that you weren't really trying to design. You were trying to design some arch, but you get these little gaps and so forth that come out as sort of accidents of what you're really trying to design for. And they're called spandrels. So there's a debate about how much of our sensory systems and how much of our physical bodies more generally are a result of specific selection pressures versus how many are spandrels or genetic drift and so forth. That's a legitimate and serious debate between the so-called selectionists and those who are not so much into selection.
Go ahead.
Rainer Mausfeld then raised that. He said, look, you're making your theorem is based on evolution by natural selection, or your proposal, and for all we know, that's a really small part of evolution. So that's not interesting. And so and Reiner's a good friend. He's a smart guy, and so a nice challenge. And so we published back. We wrote and said, Reiner's absolutely right. We have no idea how, and it's not been settled how much natural selection features as a central role in evolution. I think it does, but maybe it doesn't. But here's the point, the key point to our reply. When it's argued that we see reality as it is on evolutionary grounds, so most of my colleagues would say that evolution shapes us to see the truth.
Right.
The argument is that seeing the truth will make you more fit. In other words, it's a fitness consequence that of seeing reality that it makes you more likely to survive and pass on your genes. That's a natural selection argument, right? It's saying natural selection has shaped our senses to...
It's going to choose the more accurate perception of reality because they're going to be more fit. Yeah, they and just to recast this to see if I'm following correctly, the quote unquote, it's obvious that the sun rotates around us statement within natural selection is it's actually the fitness is going to align with whoever can grasp a reality the best, see the clearest, will get them, accumulate the most food, stay the most safe, fight off the most, of the dangers, and mate the best because they find the most apples and they can find more, perceive more from 50 feet away versus only needing to be 5 feet away. So they're gonna win over time. That's the conventional argument, or it's obvious that fitness is going to favor perception of reality. Correct? Is that
exactly right? Exactly right. And so that argument is based on natural selection.
And your argument is saying that sounds obvious, but when you take the telescope and measure the sun, and when you actually do the mathematical modeling, if you were to have one mouse that doesn't see, one species of mice that does not, that sees reality completely, one species that sees partial reality, and one that doesn't see any reality but is damn good at mating and finding food, that you run the models, these first two go extinct every single time. Right. And the one that is really well engineered for fighting, fleeing, and mating is going to put these others. And it sounds, even that kind of, I don't have the mathematical modeling in front of me, but it sounds somewhat plausible that they're going to find the girls at the bar much faster than the ones that are like, well, is the bar here? Is this even real? Is this? And the mouse and the girls are going to find the guys at the bar same way, that it's like, oh, I'm wired for this function. Right. And maybe for a generation, these two are better philosophers and are closer with reality. But within a few generations, much less 2 billion years of evolution, they're going to be kicked out of the chain.
Right.
Is that accurate?
That's a very good analogy. And I think just to another analogy that can help sort of bring this idea home is that, have two people trying to win the game of, say, Grand Theft Auto, say a VR version of Grand Theft Auto. One person has a VR headset and has a steering wheel and is playing the game that way. The other person has the ability to toggle voltages as fast as he can inside the supercomputer. So he has to toggle voltages as fast as he can to try to win the game. Who's going to win? The guy that sees the truth, namely the computer, or the guy that has a virtual reality game interface that allows him to just turn the steering wheel, press on the gas, and so forth? It's really clear that every time I turn a steering wheel, I'm toggling millions of voltages. Good luck trying to toggle those millions of voltages fast enough to win the game. And that's sort of what evolution gave us. It gave us this VR headset to allow us to toggle the voltages of reality very, very quickly without knowing what we're doing.
The audience for Below the Line is one of the maybe the densest audience of founders in the world, with about 10,000 listens per episode, there is a maybe 50% are founders of businesses. And if you have ever, as a founder, thought about selling your online business and then been rightfully apprehensive because it is a nightmare, so much of the time it is just goes, not only does it last 6 months, 8 months of negotiation, 3 more months of finalization of the deal, then a new owner runs your business into the ground that you spent years pouring yourself into. There is a reason people say acquisitions are extremely painful, but not anymore with Tiny Capital. Tiny Capital has built the dream scenario for acquisitions. They will review your business in 7 days, make an offer, and close within 30, and they'll keep running your business, whether you want to be a part of it or not. They do not buy businesses to run them into the ground, to shut them down, to acquire the talent. They keep it going. It is I truly mean this because I've had friends acquired through Tiny Capital. It's so different than any other acquisition process that I've ever heard of, between the efficiency and how they keep running and growing your business after you sell. It really is the dream scenario for selling your online business. So go to tinycapital.com/below the line. That's tinycapital.com/below the line. The link is in the show notes. Go check them out if you are interested in selling your online business today. Today's episode is also brought to you by Magic Mind, the anchor for every single morning for me. It all starts with Magic Mind. It is a beautiful little 2-ounce shot that has matcha, nootropics, adaptogens. You take it alongside your morning coffee or tea, and you get 8 to 9 hours of great energy and flow. Flow State now comes in a bottle, and it is something that I've been building for the last 7 years. Launched it, listeners know. I launched it about a year ago, and it is my favorite product to work on, but it's also quite genuinely my favorite product that I get to use. I love it more than my iPad, and every listener knows how much I love my iPad Pro. Go to magicmind.co and enter promo code BTL to get 20% off. That's magicmind.co to try it out. And you can tweet at me, get a full refund if you do not dig Magic Mind. I will personally give you the full refund. So go check it out, magicmind.co, promo code BTL. And if you do not dig it for any reason, tweet at me and I'll give you a full refund. Let's get back to the episode. Okay, so yeah, I have to ask, what is the craziest version of your articulation? Like that is accurate. If someone were to walk away from this conversation with maybe just the latest version of the 1 or 2 lines that is maybe just the most out there, that doesn't have all these breadcrumbs to build an argument around it, but is crazy.
Right. Well, that space-time is doomed. Space-time we've assumed is fundamental reality. Physics for hundreds of years has assumed space-time is fundamental reality, and objects in space-time, that's the fundamental nature of reality. Science has been based on that. And what I'm saying is it's a theorem of evolution by natural selection that's false. Space-time is not fundamental. It's our headset. Space and time, we think of them as the pre-existing stage on which the drama of life has played out. It started 13.8 billion years ago at the Big Bang. There was no life. There was no consciousness, just matter and energy in space. Life came hundreds of millions, billions of years later, and consciousness came after that. And so we are bit players, consciousness is bit players that came on very, very late on the pre-existing stage of space-time. I'm saying that entire framework is false. Space-time is merely, in the computer science language, a data structure. It's a data structure that we have that is like a VR headset that we use to interact with some other reality. So I'm not denying that there is a reality. I'm just saying, if we take evolution by natural selection seriously, the probability is 0 that anything that we see here is anything but a VR headset. It's all a VR headset. The reality is something entirely different. So that's the most stunning way of thinking about this.
And so I hope I get to both the conventional, obvious next questions for listeners as well as the unconventional ones. The conventional one would be, first off, when you have been proposing, as you've been proposing this, has there been any internal turmoil? Obviously, Darwin famously faced excommunication, just it's very stressful internal turmoil. Has there been any within you of piecing this together and saying, okay, I'm going to look like a loon to put this forward?
Well, absolutely, right? This is.
Tell me about one of those scenarios where you had the insight and then said, okay, well, I'm going to have to put this forward and potentially have blowback.
Well, yeah, this is so far out of the mainstream idea. Now, I should say that there are, I'm not alone. Steven Pinker at Harvard.
Right.
Now, I'm not going to say that he endorses everything I'm saying here. I'm not saying that, but Pinker has very clearly written that natural selection will shape us to have untrue beliefs. And he's got a paper called So How Does the Mind Work? A brilliant paper, 2005, that I highly recommend, and a book called How the Mind Works, where he gives the evolutionary arguments for why evolution could shape us to have false beliefs.
What would be an example?
Sensory beliefs.
What would be an example from his paper and book?
Well, the kinds of things that I'm talking about, but here's this is fun stuff. So I'll mention.
Please, no, indulge. Go. This is a space where you can go as wide, vast as you want.
Right. So one argument is that it's sort of deep. In a species that's cooperative, it's very fit for all of us to cooperate. We're hunter-gatherers. We all go out and hunt for food. And if I come back and I didn't get much today, I had a bad day, maybe you can share some of yours with me today, and then I'll share tomorrow, that kind of thing. But if everybody's cooperating, then another strategy from evolutionary theory that's quite fit then is to just cheat. Instead of going out there and risking my life, bringing down bisons and mammoths and so forth, I just go sit down by the river, enjoy myself, drink some water, relax, go back and say, oh boy, I just didn't get anything today. Could I have some of yours? And just be a freeloader. Well, that turns out if you're the only freeloader, it's an incredibly fit strategy. You minimize the risk to your body and you have all the food that you need. So, but of course, if everybody's a freeloader, then the whole system falls apart, right? If everybody's a freeloader, there's no food, we all die. We all starve to death. So this is what's called frequency-dependent selection. That if everybody's cooperating, then it's really fit to be the one freeloader. But if everybody's freeloading, then it's not fit anymore. You're going to die. So we haven't died. Our species hasn't died. So that means that we somehow were able to keep the freeloaders from overriding us. So what's going on there? Well, one possible mechanism is that we began to detect the cheaters, right? I mean, when I tell you that I tried real hard and didn't get anything, I'm lying. Well, I might betray, and I might blush, I might get shifty eyes, I might do something that might betray that I'm lying to you. So there would be selection pressures then for the species to start to be able to detect the cheaters. Well, then you'll get an evolutionary arms race where the cheaters get better at cheating and lying. And so this goes.
So there'd be a natural selection favoring of get better at cheating, get better at lying,
get better at lying. This is
get better at being lazy.
Exactly right.
And yeah, okay.
And so Robert Trivers, who's one of the most brilliant evolutionary theorists of the last several decades, point out that the ultimate deceiver, the one who's really best at this evolutionary arms race of deceiving, is the one who's self-deceived, who no longer believes
their own bullshit.
That's exactly right. They were deeply self-deceived. And so on evolutionary grounds, you could argue that maybe almost everything that I believe about myself and my own motives is deeply false, and that there were selection pressures for me to be self-deceived. So that's an interesting argument
because it's deeply efficient.
That's right. It's like
in that community.
That's right. For those who've seen Seinfeld, there's George says it's not a lie if you believe it. right? And
Right. And there's a great book, a great leadership book on self-deception. And it is, it's a book that if someone hands it to you, you might recoil. And yet you read it, you take a few chapters in and you realize, holy shit, I'm self-deceiving myself to a degree that I, by definition, thought this book is for other people. And 3 chapters in, to exactly your point,
right.
it is, you start to think, wait, I have constructed so much of this artificially, and it can result in something real. So you think, I am a good leader. I'm a 22-year-old. I'm a good leader. I'm going to start a software company. It starts to do well. And you're like, maybe I am a good leader because you lying got you food in that community and it was efficient. So you're like, oh, this is how you get food. But in the book, it does, right, fake it till you make it. But in the book, it talks about the massive comeuppance that is waiting for you. And similarly, the community disappears. You get separated from the community. You don't really know how to get food. You're pretty effed.
That's right. That's right. So these kinds of arguments are not new in evolutionary theory. There are arguments that we're going to have shortcuts, heuristics. We're going to cut corners. There are going to be some selection pressures to be self-deceived and so forth. But what's interesting to me is that even the theorists who have made these arguments, when it comes to everyday perception, looking at an apple, almost every one of them stops short there. So that's where I sort of jumped off the cliff, even for these evolutionary theorists. Everyday middle-sized objects like tables and chairs and so forth, to say that we've been shaped to be deceived about them, that they're not the truth. There's very few people who are saying that. And so that's where I knew I needed to have the theorems.
When did you what year about did you say, okay, I'm about to take both feet off this ledge and there's no one really saying this?
In my book, Visual Intelligence, I proposed the interface theory. And when I got deafening silence on that aspect of the book, I realized, okay, there's only one way for me to be taken seriously. I need a theorem. So that was around 2006. I realized, okay, I've got to take this to the next level. If I have a theorem, then this will have to be taken seriously. And by the way, if I can't get a theorem, then maybe I shouldn't take it seriously either, right? Mm-hmm. So that was. So
when did you have the theory? Around 2009, 2010?
Well, I got the simulations that were pretty compelling from my 2 graduate students in 2010, and we published them in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, which is a very prestigious journal. It's the premier journal in this area. So it was.
Was that exciting just to get it? I'm so interested in this part of you do work and then it's once you get a TED Talk, it's one thing, but the 5 years before and you're kind of in the wilderness, that's what I'm always interested in.
Yeah, that was in the wilderness, and it was difficult. We had published, we'd done the simulations, and my students had worked very, very hard. They probably ran roughly 1 million simulations. We were just looking for good enough statistics to get confidence in this result. But here's a natural, so we published it. It's a strong result, but the reply that people could still give is, look, simulations are simulations. Maybe you didn't get the right set of conditions that would show the cases in which truth would evolve. So we remain unconvinced. And as a scientist, I perfectly understand that. I mean, that's a fair position. And so that's why I went to Chetan Prakash, my good friend and mathematician, and said, Chetan, I think there's a theorem here. In fact, I need a theorem, for this to be taken seriously. And so Chetan and I worked on that for several years, but it was Chetan's brilliance as a mathematician that pulled it through. And this last year, we had the theorems. It took us several years to get through the review process, but last year we got 2 papers published in peer-reviewed journals with theorems.
And what was the reaction there?
Well, the reaction is, I mean, scientists have their ideas, and what they think is right, but they also listen when there's contradictory, strong evidence. And so when I say I've got a theorem and I state the theorem and I give the logic of it, I'm treated with respect. Absolutely. So this is not like, so my colleagues, I think, are doing exactly the right thing. They should be skeptical. Absolutely. This is a really bold and unusual claim. On the other hand, I mean, so for example, UC Davis, there's a neuroscience research institute up there with lots of cognitive neuroscientists studying the brain and postdocs and so forth. They invited me up a couple of years ago to give a talk on why neurons don't exist when they're not perceived. Right? They invited me. They knew I was going to say that. So here, these are neuroscientists, and I'm saying that nothing in space-time exists when it's not perceived. We construct everything, including we construct brains and we construct neurons. So strictly speaking, neurons cause none of my behavior and none of my conscious experiences. They invited me to come up there and tell them that. And I was treated very, very respectfully, and I gave them my logic, and we had a very cordial and professional conversation. And I didn't hesitate at the right point of my talk to say what this entails is that although for everyday neuroscience is perfectly fine to talk as though, area V4 of visual cortex causes my color experiences, and I do that myself in everyday neuroscience, I talk that way. But strictly speaking, it's false. And I gave them the reasons for it. And I was well received. And that's what I love about science. They will not countenance fools. So if someone is saying something as nonsensical as that neurons don't exist, if they don't have a theorem, if they don't have anything like that, then they will not be listened to. But if it sounds nonsensical, but you have a theorem that's based on our best current science, they will listen respectfully. They will try, of course, to take it down. That's what science is about. So I felt that science is working the way it should. There's the right kind of skeptical reception, but there is reception. People listen and they know that, okay, I've raised the bar. There's a theorem on the table. Now it's not about hand waves. It's what assumptions of the theorem do you disagree with and what would you change? Right. So I've raised the level.
Right. And I've seen a lot of the counter arguments they just ding off. They're pretty easy to deflect, and that's the power of a theorem and all of the modeling. What do you call your position? And do you mind telling listeners the names of the other positions? Physicalists or materialists, just to give a kind of landscape here.
Right. So I would say that 95+% of my colleagues who are the serious scientists in cognitive neuroscience and so forth are physicalists. So I would say that this is almost the universal foundation for science for the last 400 years, is that space-time is fundamental. Space-time and its contents are the fundamental nature of reality, at least since Newton, Galileo even.
And before that, it was more spiritual of this is a temporary.
Well, before then, we didn't really have science. And the ideas of the Greeks were interesting, but Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. But there's nothing there that is recognizable as like modern science, where you really start to see that with Galileo. Careful experiments, very, very controlled, looking at data, and then trying to write down mathematical equations to capture what you're doing. That you don't. I mean, you see brilliance in the Greeks, but you don't see that. And so the big shift happened around the time of Galileo, and part of that shift was the central role of mathematics in making our ideas precise and looking for the implications of our ideas, and also the framework that Galileo set as well. That he thought that things like colors, odors, and smells were not objective reality. They were just sort of our senses. That's what we create. So he actually believed that we create what we smell and the colors that we see. Those aren't objective reality. But he thought that space-time and physical objects with their mass and their positions and their movements, that was objective reality. And that framework is central to physicalism. And it's been incredibly successful since Galileo. So science has been built on this physicalist framework. So consciousness is not fundamental, life is not fundamental, space-time and particles, now we would call them particles, elementary particles and energy, are fundamental.
Those are the canvas, and everything else is painted on that canvas, so to speak.
Absolutely. It's painted on that canvas in a precise reductionist sense. That the laws, as you go to smaller and smaller scales in space-time, you get to more and more fundamental nature of reality, and you find deeper and deeper laws. So the laws of particle physics are the deepest. The laws of chemistry are emergent from the deeper laws of physics. Mm-hmm. The processes of biology are emergent from those of chemistry. The processes of neuroscience are emergent from the processes of biology, and consciousness is emergent from, presumably, the neuroscience. Although some physicalists would also say it could be emergent from other complex physical systems that don't involve neurons. Say, the rightly crafted artificial intelligences might also have the right kind of complex physical dynamics to give rise to consciousness. But the big picture is this reductionism. We go to smaller and smaller scales to get the deeper and more fundamental laws. And then from those, we can show how the other laws of the less fundamental or special sciences are emergent from these deeper laws of physics.
And so physicalists would be similar to emergence, a theory of emergence. They would be
yes.
one to one in terms of how they would view the world.
That's right, because they would say it's a physical emergence.
And what are the alternatives? And what do you call your position?
Well, so an alternative that Descartes offered, René Descartes, is famous for saying that there's, in addition to the physical world, which is like a machine, there is this spiritual world of, and so it's called dualism. There's physical stuff, and then there's sort of mental or consciousness stuff or spiritual stuff, and they're on equal footing. So the physicalist says there's only physical stuff, and what looks like consciousness really is just some complicated action of physical stuff. That's what it really is. The dualist, like Descartes, says, no, there's really the machine, the physical stuff, but then there's also this soul stuff, and many religions take this point of view. And Descartes, what he said was fit in with the Christianity, which was dominant at the time, that there's a soul and a body, and they're in some sense perhaps one's not reducible to the other, right? Mm-hmm. Physical stuff stands on its own, the soul stuff stands on its own, but they do interact. And Descartes famously thought that they interacted at the pineal gland, which of course is just false, but it was a brilliant hypothesis at the time. And then there's the point of view that's sometimes called idealism, and so Berkeley was an idealist, saying that all that exists, to be is to be perceived or to be a perceiver. That's a nice statement of idealism. Kant, Hegel, so there's a whole tradition of idealism. My views fit into that, but I don't call my view idealism, partly because there's a lot of baggage. Idealism is often conflated with anti-realism, that you don't think that certain things are real. But you don't think certain things are real. You don't think anything that we perceive is real. Oh, I see. But you do think there is a canvas beneath it that is real. Yes, that's right. So I call it conscious realism. So my view is I call it conscious realism. And I should say, the theorem that I have about evolution by natural selection that says none of our senses show us the truth. Again, I'm not saying that evolution by natural selection is true. I'm not saying it's correct. I'm saying I don't have a better theory, and that's what our best theories entails. I would like to think that we do perceive some aspects of reality. We might not, but I would like a deeper theory that allows the possibility that human beings do have some traffic with the truth.
Right.
Now,
Do you personally, you said you would like to believe, do you feel like we do have some traffic with the truth,
I think so. And that's what I'm working on, is a theory that would make that possible. That according to this theory, it may be that, strictly speaking, space, our perceptions of space and time and matter and so forth are not telling us reality as it is, but there is some aspect of what we're perceiving that is true. And of course, what I have to do to be taken seriously on this is I have to show, first, if there's a deeper theory of reality, what is that theory? What is that reality? What is this dynamics? It has to be mathematically precise. Then I have to show how space-time emerges from it. And so I have to show some kind of projection from this deeper theory to space-time. And in that projection, I have to show why this deeper theory looks like evolution by natural selection in the space-time projection. So a lot of work that I have to do, right? So if I want to say that evolution by natural selection entails we don't see the truth, but evolution by natural selection is not the deepest theory, then I need a deeper theory. And I need to show how evolution by natural selection emerges from that deeper theory precisely. I've got to get exactly evolution by natural selection, or I'm wrong, so that I can understand why evolution is telling us that we don't see the truth, but this deeper theory allows us to at least see some of the truth. To give an analogy of what we have to do here, when we had Newton's theory of physics, right? And in Newton's theory, we had the notion that you have a definite position and a definite momentum. Every object has a definite value of both. Things that happen here simultaneously, there's a notion of simultaneity that's true across the universe and so forth. And when Einstein came along and wrote down special relativity and then general relativity, one thing that we wanted to do was to make contact with Newton. In other words, how does Newton fit into this deeper, broader theory? And you can make that kind of connection. In some sense, you can get Newton as a limiting case of Einstein as the speed of light goes to infinity. So if you take Einstein's theory and just let the speed of light get bigger and bigger and go to infinity, then you get something that looks like Newton's theory. And so you could make this contact and see, physicists could see how Newton was, in some sense, Newton was great on its own, its own theory, and even the notion of mass in Newton is different than the notion of mass in Einstein. But nevertheless, you could see broadly how Newton is a special case of Einstein, and also how Newton is a special case of quantum theory. When quantum theory came around, in some sense, something called Planck's constant, if that goes to zero, then you get something that looks like Newton. So I have to. And
was that Einstein's work to incorporate this previous notion or step on the ladder, and obviously break ground on a new step of the ladder and incorporate them within each other, or was that physicists outside of Einstein that compatibilized them?
Well, I think Einstein his own work made it pretty clear right up front that the relationship between the two. But of course, many philosophers of science and many physicists have thought about that and elaborated on it in the decades since Einstein. But already I would say that it was pretty clear from Einstein's own work how Newton sort of fit in there. And it was pretty clear from the first work on quantum theory how, again, Newton's kind of framework would fit in the special case when Planck's constant got arbitrarily small. And so I need to do the same kind of thing here. If I have a deeper theory that allows us to see the truth, then I have to show how space-time and evolution by natural selection are special cases of that deeper theory, which is not a trivial task, right? That's not
right.
hard. That's not
okay.
to do.
In the models, it says that, and so a few of these conventional questions. Well, first off, you can close your eyes and not perceive the sun, but it would still influence through gravitational pull the Earth, right? There would be influence outside of perception, or the moon and the waves. How do you how does your argument feature that influence outside of perception?
Right. So even our experience of gravity is, from the point of view of evolution by natural selection, merely a format of our perceptions, not a deep truth. So Einstein's theory of gravity says that gravity is the shape of space-time, the curvature of space-time.
I'm nodding my head, but I'm like, I'm a simple Texan just trying to put this together. Okay, yeah, keep going.
Well, almost everybody's had trouble with Einstein's theory there, but it's incredible that gravity is, according to Einstein, how space is curved. That's what it is. So we think of space as, well, if we think about it at all, is flat. And Einstein said, no, it's not flat, it curves. And it's the fact that we live in curved space that's pushing my seat into the chair right now. I'm sitting pushed into the chair, not because there's a force of gravity, but because I'm in a curved space and I'm just moving along the curve, and that curve is putting me into my chair. And so it's a strange thing to wrap your head around. But then I'm saying that space-time itself, which Einstein took as fundamental, right? He's saying space-time is fundamental, but it curves, and that's what gravity is. I'm saying space-time is doomed. Space-time is not fundamental. There's something deeper.
And where does that epilogue go, or the next chapter? If space-time is maybe the second, third chapter, what is chapter 4?
What is the deeper reality?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the right answer is I don't know. But as a scientist, I'm going to propose a theory, and
please,
and then hopefully my other scientists will come along and spank me with their own, mathematics and their own observations.
Well, what's great is you've already proven to be very, very, very thoughtful if someone's going to go against what you're thinking, because you tend to follow it up with theorems. But yeah, tell me, what does if chapter 3 is space-time, is infinite, that is the reality, what's chapter 4?
So my proposal is that consciousness is fundamental. And the reason I go there is partly poverty of my imagination in the following sense. One of the biggest open problems in cognitive neuroscience today, what we call the hard problem of consciousness. And it's the question of how our conscious experiences, like the taste of chocolate, the smell of garlic, a headache, the feeling of velvet, how are these simple conscious experiences related to brain activity, or to the physical world more generally? But usually we think about it in terms of brain activity. And we call it the hard problem of consciousness because my brilliant colleagues have, for many decades now, been trying to show how brain activity can cause specific conscious experiences, and have utterly failed. We can't, none of the theories can explain how brain activity causes even one specific conscious experience. And we can go into those theories and why they fail if you're interested. But so my attitude was, okay, if we failed to start with physical stuff like the brain, and we can't boot up consciousness. And now evolution is telling us, well, it's a theorem that no physical objects exist when they're not perceived anyway. Brains don't exist when they're not perceived. So that's why they don't do it. The reason why we can't get brain activity to boot up consciousness is because brain activity isn't fundamental. It doesn't even exist when it's not perceived. So let me start the other way. Let me start with consciousness and try to boot up space, time, and brains. So most of my colleagues are starting with space, time, and brains and try to boot up consciousness. But that contradicts evolution by natural selection. Evolution by natural selection says that's the wrong direction.
It's not too dissimilar from, you have the brain, and last night you created an entire world in your dream that included walls, that included other people, and that dream included you having a brain within it. And
that's exactly right.
And you felt like it was real, and yet that was a complete figment of consciousness.
That's a good analogy to think about this as, space-time is just the format of the dream. So this is a dream in consciousness. Or I like to use virtual reality headset. And so here's the big picture of where I'm going with this. I'm proposing that reality is like a vast social network of interacting conscious entities that I call conscious agents. So think about the Twitterverse, right? There's tens of millions of Twitter users, billions of tweets. There's no way that a Twitter user could ever read all the tweets or interact with all the tweets. It's just overwhelming. So what do we do when we have just overwhelming quantities of social media data? What do? We use visualization tools. Ideal case would be to have a VR headset that we use that I can like zoom out and see what's trending in all of the United States, and zoom in and see what's trending in New York City, and then zoom down.
Zoom in and see what my 3 friends are saying.
My friends are doing
right
exactly, and zoom back out. And notice when you do that, you're going to have some simple eye candy, like colorful objects that are doing certain things that you know how to interpret. That, oh, this is what's trending in New York versus what's trending in Beijing, and so forth. And you don't, only if you zoom into a particular Twitter user are you going to see an actual user, right? Most of the time, you're only going to see icons that are sort of smearing over and simplifying stuff. Well, that's the point. So reality is this vast social network of conscious agents, and some conscious agents have a visualization tool. We call it space-time and physical objects. So space-time is just the VR headset that some agents, maybe a very, very small, vanishing small fraction of agents, use the kind of headset that we use. Most conscious agents probably have conscious experiences that you and I can't even concretely imagine.
Meaning like a red blood cell has a different conscious experience that we
Great question. It's not that, for example, red blood cells are conscious, or in fact, strictly speaking, the human body is not conscious, right? The human body that you see is just an icon that you create when you look at me. When I look at you, I see an icon that I create of your body. When I look away, I delete that icon. Fortunately, I don't delete your consciousness. Your consciousness still exists. So the body that I create is clearly not identical to your consciousness because you're still conscious. And
potentially could be solipsistic, and you are just playing around in the VR world by yourself.
You're absolutely that. I can't dismiss solipsism, which is the idea that all that exists is me and my perceptions. I mean, I can't dismiss that, although I'm not proposing it, but I can't dismiss it.
And just from a high level, there was physicalism, emergence. There was dualism. There was idealism. There was conscious realism. Your articulation. Right. Solipsism could be a fifth version, and there could be a sixth of non-dualism. Or would that kind of fit with?
There is something that's called a neutral monism that certain philosophers have proposed. So a neutral monism, my feeling is that neutral monism doesn't really work, that it either degenerates into a physicalism or a dualism.
Okay, so we'll take it. Well, but I just wanted to recap that for my own own edification. And so the white blood cell, or go back to that red blood cell example where you're kind of correcting my language of it's conscious, but I can't connect with its conscious experience.
Right. Yeah, that's an important little distinction here, because if we take seriously that everything that you see is just a headset and just a virtual reality, then the things that I see in it, like blood cells and people, they're just icons, right?
I see.
So strictly speaking, they're not conscious. Nothing that I see is itself conscious. I'm just seeing an icon. So then why would you say when you look away, you delete me as an icon, but my consciousness doesn't go away? Why would you assume that I have a consciousness? Oh, so that's the assumption of this theory. So that's the big founding assumption of conscious realism, that space-time isn't fundamental, physical objects aren't fundamental, but what does exist, contrary to solipsism. So I'm proposing that solipsism is false, and that there are countless other consciousnesses out there. I have a consciousness, and I may be many consciousnesses that collaborate to create the consciousness that I call my consciousness, but that there are countless there's a whole vast network of consciousnesses. So it's a vast social network. That's the proposal.
And why couldn't a red blood cell, or why, just so that I understand the specific point, why would you say, no, that's a slight distinction, that red blood cell couldn't have consciousness if for example...
For the same reasons that I claim that your body doesn't have consciousness.
Oh, okay. I see. So it's, there could be this collaboration of consciousness, it says, within me, but to ascribe them to specific parts wouldn't necessarily work.
Well, yeah, it's like saying, if I'm using this VR headset for the Twitterverse, right? And I've got some icon for what's trending in the United States, and say it's a green ball. And if I say, well, so that, are you saying that the green ball is a bunch of Twitter users? Well, no. I'm not saying the green ball is a bunch of Twitter users. The green ball is just my icon that's showing me what's trending across the United States of the Twitter users.
So me being a collaboration, and I've heard you talk about this, I'd love to hear you go. I want to pursue this further. I could be a collaboration of consciousnesses, but right. And when these words are coming out of my mouth and I'm speaking in a space-time constrained way, it is consciousness going through, a coffee straw and having to articulate these words. And right. These words are a culmination of a collaboration of consciousnesses and you're not saying it's your red blood cell and your kidney is a collaboration. You're saying that maybe my consciousness with my wife, my children, my parents, my friends, it's right. That interstitched consciousness that has created me, or created this culmination of consciousness in which these sentences are falling out of my mouth.
Right. And also maybe a whole lattice of other consciousnesses that for example, so there's sort of the outside consciousness, like your children, your wife, and so forth, but there's also other consciousnesses that are collaborating to create you. And when we use our interface, when you use your interface to...
Now we're getting funky, by the way, everybody. We are getting... the world in general is getting so weird so fast. But this is one of the main pillars in which any listener listening to this, not only is this it just so out there and awesome. I actually won't say it's crazy because it's... well, you got a theorem, and it also is. We've been so wrong about what we thought was obvious before. We likely will be again, but even this conversation is getting so weird so fast, but in such a awesome way. So keep going on the collaboration of consciousnesses.
Right. So I would the way that this model is working out. It turns out when two conscious agents interact, they form a new conscious agent, and this can go on forever. So
we're forming a new conscious agent right now.
That's right, and I'm very interested to know how much the lower level agents can know about the higher agent that they're creating. This is all mathematics, by the way. The theory of consciousness is published. I'm working. It's called, if you want to Google and read the math, it's called Objects of Consciousness. So if you Google objects,
we'll put the link. Yeah, we'll put the link in the show notes.
You can go read it. You can see the math. You can see the mathematical proposals. But the math says that two agents interacting create a new agent. And at higher and higher levels, agents create more and more agents, so that you are not just one agent. You're this whole lattice of interacting conscious agents. And when you use your interface, your space-time interface, to try to interact with that whole lattice of conscious agents, what you see are things like bodies, brains, neurons, and cells. But those are just the interface icons that you use that dumb down this really complex, vast social network that's you. So you're this incredible social network, very, very complicated, an entire nation of interacting conscious agents. But all you can see of yourself is what your dumbed down user interface lets you see. And what you see is neurons and brains and cells and so forth. Those are just icons which are hiding an incredible complex reality.
Two questions. One, is there any ancient mythology or philosophy that gets close to this?
There are. I have been...
and by the way, do you feel like you have to tiptoe around things like that because you are a scientist and you feel like, okay, I have to be conscious, or I have to be cognizant of what sticks on me in these conversations, just out of personal curiosity. Do you feel like you have to, okay, I'm not going to wade in that water because it's not serious?
Well, for me as a scientist, that's what tenure is for. Tenure is there not for you to just sit down and rest on your laurels. Tenure is there for you to be brave, to go out there and try.
If you're not the freeloader, but we already talked about the evolutionary pressure in that direction.
Freeloading, but not at the University of California. I'll say University of California, we make sure that there are very, very few freeloaders. We're on it. But what tenure is really for is once a person has proven that they are a scientist, that they can do creative work, then we give them tenure and we say, okay, you've proven that you're not just a charlatan, that you can actually do serious work. You're now free to go into dangerous areas that may not be well received and may take years before you actually get results.
But when it gets into the, how would you say, kind of the intuitive side of the brain that has led to a lot of cultures developing a concept of a higher power, of a higher perceiving consciousness, for lack of a better term. Do you feel like you have to it's better for your credibility to not enter and wade into that territory? Or do you feel like with tenure, no, I can go, we can walk wherever we want?
I feel that as long as I'm sticking to doing rigorous science, I'm free to get my ideas wherever I want. So I'm very happy to listen to the ideas of Buddhists, Hindus,
and
Islamic.
Are there any ancient philosophies that you feel like you'd say, wow, there's some strange similarities?
I think that there are deep similarities, deep resonances with mystical traditions of all sorts of types around the world, Eastern and Western, especially the mystical traditions of those. I think that there's a lot in contact. I've given a talk to the Dalai Lama and had a conversation with the Dalai Lama about ideas here.
Are there any specific philosophies that you'd see? Because it's almost like if they talk too much, if they say too much, then they'd get disqualified in this realm in which you're chipping away at. But if they stick to almost a local area code and stick to that area code, this is not real or this is real, that maybe it almost lays or it's hand in glove with what you're proposing. Are there any that are hand in glove that come to mind?
Well, I would say that there are some that are very broadly compatible, right? In the sense that, so for example, in I'm no expert in these areas, but in some versions of Hindu philosophy, there's this notion of Maya, that's sometimes translated illusion, and one could make the argument that notion of Maya in Hindu philosophy is something like my idea of a user interface, that we've been shaped not to see the truth, but we have a user interface. But my attitude about these things is I do want to listen to the various spiritual traditions, and I actively interact with people from those traditions and listen to their ideas, because they've spent a lot of time thinking about consciousness in these traditions. And scientists are relative newcomers to the table when it comes to studying consciousness. Now we catch up quickly, and we have some tools that no one else has. So I listen to spiritual traditions and their ideas just like I listen to the ideas of my scientific peers, with the appropriate skepticism, right? So I take nothing for granted. By the way, I don't believe my own theories. Right. If I had to bet, is my theory of consciousness correct? I would bet against me. And I would bet that our current best theories in physics and in natural sciences will be overthrown, that we will find deeper theories. So that is my attitude about things. What we do is work with what we have right now, try to get the best theories, and be precise so that we can figure out as quickly as possible precisely where we're wrong. So I'm not worried about hanging out with people from various spiritual traditions and listening to their ideas. I listen for good ideas. I don't believe them more. I don't believe my own theories. It's not about belief. It's really about getting the best ideas, asking, can we fashion these ideas into a mathematically precise theory, see what that theory entails, and figure out where it's wrong. That's sort of my attitude. My attitude is, of course we're wrong. We probably have little insights here and there that are really useful insights that we should draw on. Probably most of what we think are insights are nonsense, and that includes in science and in spiritual traditions. So I'm arguing for a deep humility on all sides. The humility to listen attentively and respectfully to the ideas, think about them for ourselves, figure out which ones make sense, try to turn them into a mathematically precise theory, and then see where that leads. So I have
amen to the humility. That's the delineation between philosophy and religiosity, and it's that's refreshing to hear from a scientist that is also making these wildly different claims, but also has the mathematics and modeling and rigor behind it. Are there in that realm of kind of crazy territory? Are there what's the best way of asking this? Are there substances like something like DMT? Are there psychedelics that substances out there that would dial down the focus on fitness payoffs and allow you to see more objectively? And
a great way to ask the question. That's a really good way to ask the question. I think the answer is yes. And to get specifics about how that might work, I have to actually elaborate the mathematics that I'm working on of conscious agents and show precisely how space-time arises as an interface. And I have to show precisely how we get the laws of particle physics. For example, the scattering amplitudes that, two gluons smashing into each other, 4 gluons go spraying out at the Large Hadron Collider. We can write down scattering amplitudes. I need to start with the theory of conscious agents and its dynamics, show exactly how it projects into space-time, and show exactly what aspect of the dynamics gets projected into what we call gluon-gluon scattering. And I have to show exactly the right scattering amplitudes arise from that projection. Then I can start to answer the kind of question that you just posed, which is, when I do something like take a chemical like 5-DMT, to answer your question, I'm going to have to now say, okay, I've got the chemical structure of 5-DMT. Now that I've got this mapping from consciousness into space-time, I can reverse engineer. I can pull back and say, okay, what is 5-DMT correspond to back in the realm of conscious agents? What dynamics is going on there? When I take 5-DMT and it's interacting with certain receptors,
it brings the pineal gland back into the conversation potentially.
Yeah, pineal gland potentially. Right.
The pineal gland.
Pineal, right.
Yeah, it potentially brings it back into the conversation. At least we don't know how it works, but I've never done. I've done ayahuasca. I've never done 5-EO, is it 5-MeO DMT?
Right, yeah.
And I've never done it, but they surmise that it's working on the DMN, the default mode network, which in your theory would say none of this exists, and these are all just limited words, and icons, and the ego, the self and perception of self and preservation of this bodily self is located in that DMN, and DMT lowers the volume on that somehow. So that's why I ask around DMT.
I think that's a very promising direction. Absolutely. And by the way, I would not say not to use that language of the default mode network and so forth, because that's the best language we have right now. So I would myself describe it that way because I don't have the deeper theory. But the deeper theory, to really answer your question at a deep level, I need to be able to pull back both the default mode network and 5-MeO-DMT back into the realm of conscious agents and ask what's going on there. Are they really, is what's happening when I put 5-MeO-DMT into my neurons or the pineal gland, or wherever it's acting or affecting the default mode network, do I have evidence that what that's doing is really changing the structure of my interface construction in this realm of conscious agents? Because my interface itself is the product of conscious agents that are collaborating. They collaborate to create my interface. So when I pull back all these things into the realm of conscious agents, I can ask, does
this plant consciousness, 1 + 1 = 3 of this plant consciousness and my own conscious, I guess there is a language in which it does fit within your language. But I see that we also have value in saying, all right, there is this DMN, default mode network, and I see. If I were to, what's going through my head is that I think it was in 2017 scientists showed that moods are contagious, like a cold. That you can catch negativity, you can catch positivity, and that's going through my head of this when you say this kind of connected consciousness. In collaborating consciousness. Also, in the Lotus Sutra, I know that it talks about a Buddha can only, and this isn't canonical within all of Buddhism, but within the Lotus Sutra, it says that a Buddha can only become Buddha when interacting with another Buddha, and requires interaction with another consciousness.
Yes. To
become Buddha, which then basically kind of, you could follow that line of thinking. The implications are pretty profound when it's like, okay, you cannot do this on your own. And then,
yes.
Yes. And then the other thing within Maya, I'm a massive fan of the philosophy of Vedanta, which is at the seat of Hinduism, which is the seat of Buddhism, and Buddhism at the seat of all of the subdivisions and Zen and so on, but all going back 5,000 years ago to Vedanta, where it is a central premise of this is all illusion, which sounds crazy. It's similar to you. It is always the last chapter of the book. It's always very easy to understand things, and then the last chapter is, oh, and by the way, Maya, this is all an illusion. The better the spiritual teacher, the better they can navigate that. But these are different things that are going through my head. It makes me want to also ask, and that is interesting that I didn't know what you'd say on the question of substances dialing down our focus on fitness payoffs. But if I were to recast the concept in my own words, when I'm describing it to a friend at dinner or my wife, am I getting this right, that you're saying that through the theory of evolution or evolutionary influences towards natural selection, we're sitting here right now like a magnet that thinks, okay, I can look in 360 degrees. I could go in any direction I want. I've got free will, and then you introduce an electric magnetic pulse that turns on or was always on, and that magnet thinks it can go anywhere, and yet it's like, no, okay, I have 1 degree, and I don't get to choose the others because of what's within me and the pressure within me reacting with the pressure to just reacting instead of acting. And similarly, these fitness payoffs are what's going through my head constantly of, I'm not just viewing the world, I'm thinking, is there a snake in those rocks? As well as, that apple is 3 feet away. That's a better apple to eat to satiate some biological urge, and that's better than the apple 100 feet away, so I'm going to choose that. And all of these things are happening with these fitness payoffs. And I think, oh, I'm choosing my world, and yet I'm more like the magnet that can really only go 1 degree and not 360. Is that accurate at all?
Well, within the framework of my colleagues of physicalism and neurobiological reductionism and evolution by natural selection, absolutely, that's within that framework. What you've described is, I would say, a standard view that our feeling that we have free will is a useful illusion, but we don't really have free will. We're sort of pushed and pulled by the neural circuits that have been shaped by evolution by natural selection. And by the way, that's the best language that we have so far, right? That's the best theory we have so far. When I go to conscious realism, I'm hoping to find a deeper theory in which there is free will, that it is really real, that there is consciousness, that space-time is just a headset, it's just a VR headset. And the story that we just told, in which we are, it's a reductionist story in terms of neurons and neural processes and so forth, and no free will, that we will understand that story as the natural headset version, the dumbed down version of a deeper theory of consciousness, in which it's this vast interacting social network of conscious agents where there is perhaps genuine freedom of will and free creation. And it's a creative process of exploration. It's not reductionist, it's not mechanistic in any way, but it looks mechanistic, it looks reductionist, it looks deterministic, and it looks like there's no free will when you collapse it into our headset representation.
So you're basically saying, yeah, that shirt you chose, where you chose to live, that career, where and how you're sitting is not based on reality, but based on fitness payoffs. And like the magnet and the electromagnetic switch, there is a world in which you turn it off, and that magnet is not influenced. It does not just have this illusion of 360 degrees, but really is free to go in any direction. But when you put that VR headset on, or when you wake up in 2021, the world we're living in right now, that electromagnetic switch is on, and you are so influenced by it that it's not even 1 degree of 360 degrees. You are shielded from all 360 degrees.
Right. So
you don't have to say right if I'm getting this wrong, by the way, but I'm just trying to kind of, it blew my mind just in the first half of your argument to realize every decision I'm making is so many ways obvious, but is around fitness payoffs, to the nth degree that I'm only seeing the world in fitness payoffs. And 24 hours a day, I'm thinking about efficiencies and accumulation and ... all these. And that first half blew me away. And then I guess the second half is there is a world in which you can turn that, or it doesn't exist.
That's right. The first world that you described turns out to be extremely powerful. It's the field of evolutionary psychology. It's an incredibly powerful field, evolutionary psychology. And for people who are interested, a good book to start is Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works, a great introduction to evolutionary psychology. Incredibly powerful. It's right now the best tool we have for understanding human behavior. And I've used it as a consultant for companies to help them with their marketing and advertising and product design and so forth. It works. It works incredibly well. So when I say I want a deeper theory that goes beyond evolution by natural selection, goes beyond evolutionary psychology, it's not because I disrespect evolutionary psychology. We don't have a better theory. That is the best theory of human nature that we have right now. It's the most predictive theory that we have. It's incredibly powerful. So I'm going for a deeper theory that shows why evolutionary psychology principles emerge from this deeper, more free notion of consciousness when it gets projected into a headset in which you have limited information. And that's the goal of what I'm trying to get at there. We'll see if it works.
And so you're going this third step of not just everything is influence or mind, but you're saying, can that organism see reality? And you're saying, and the mathematical model says 0% chance it sees that objective reality.
Yeah, that's right. And here's a nice way to think about it. From this broader point of view, evolution by natural selection is a theory only inside the headset. right? And what that theory tells you is everything you see around you, hey, this is just a headset. In other words, the theory worked. Evolution by natural selection is telling us, hey, this is just a headset. Space and time isn't the reality, it's a headset. And by the way, physics also says the same thing. So physicists like Nima Arkani Hamed and others are saying space-time is doomed, that space-time has been assumed to be fundamental, but it's over. That the space, and I can explain why precisely they want to get rid of it as the fundamental, but they're looking for deeper structures beyond space-time. So everybody.
And what are the proposed? I feel like I need to ask for a minute of just what are the proposed structures beyond space-time.
So what these guys are finding are two big features of space-time are what we call locality and unitarity. Things happen locally in space-time, at points in space-time, and unitarity is something about quantum mechanics that things evolve probabilistically, and the probability is always sum to one, and so forth. Well, it turns out they're finding structures like something called the amplituhedron or cosmological polytope. There are deep geometric structures that are not in space-time; they're beyond space-time. They don't even have Hilbert spaces in them, like which you need to talk about quantum mechanics. So they're beyond quantum mechanics because they have no obvious Hilbert spaces. They're not restricted to locality and space-time.
Do we perceive them at all? Is there any way to perceive them? Is this related in some way to dark matter or anything?
They just write these things down as mathematical entities. So right now, all we have is math.
So it's almost like not being able to smell bacon. If the whole world couldn't smell bacon, but you theorized, I think there is a smell out there. If no one could smell at all, you theorized, I think there is
there's something deeper,
something out there that you can smell.
Right.
And trying to hypothesize on that.
And that's what the physicists are doing. They're saying, look, we have all these mathematical models of space-time, which have been very, very good. But now we have good reason to believe that space-time is doomed. It's not fundamental. And they're trying to flash a flashlight into the dark. What's behind space-time, right? There's darkness out there. How do you start to see what might be behind space-time? The only tool they have is mathematics. And they're finding these mathematical structures. And what they find is these structures do actually let them predict the scattering processes precisely. They can actually predict particle scattering events at the Large Hadron Collider, the probability, the amplitudes, with high precision. And the interesting thing is these new structures don't care about space-time. They have symmetries that can't be seen in space-time, and they make the math much easier. They can if you do it in space-time using what we call Feynman diagrams, it takes hundreds of pages of algebra just to write down the amplitude for one scattering, like 2 gluons in, 5 out.
So it's like E equals MC squared but for this fourth dimension or what this larger structure outside of space-time.
That's the weird thing. It's fun for the young physicists. This is really fun because they found these structures and they're exploring them. They don't know what it's about, right? It's like if you ask them, well, what's going on out there? What are the processes that are going? Don't know. But there are these mathematical structures that then allow us to see symmetries in the data that we can't see in space-time, which is huge.
This is so nuts.
Right. It's really fun. And for the young physicists, this is not a problem. This is like, thank you. This is an incredible gift. We get to explore. We're the pioneers beyond space-time.
And we're going to make everyone look like Newtons, smart, step in the right direction, but vastly incomplete. So as we near the end of our time, 2 quick questions for you. This is just so fascinating. It basically, and when you say doomed, you're basically saying like that's going to be, we're going to look back and say, oh, that's when everyone thought the world was flat. Oh, that's when everyone thought that. So it's not like that's a step in the right direction. You feel like that's just going to get tossed out of the textbooks completely, except for the footnote of this is what they used to think. How ridiculous. That type of it's doomed.
Well, yes. Well, so space-time is doomed is actually not my quote. It's that the physicists themselves say space-time is doomed. That's their quote. So I'm quoting them. It's
go
not
ahead.
that they're going to disrespect space-time. It's rather they're going to treat it like they treat Newton. I mean, we treat Newton with great respect. I mean, it was an act of genius and an incredible step forward, and yet it has so many limitations that we now know how to go past. Sorry.
Well, and what I always say is, if Newton was so smart, why didn't he do the Einstein stuff? And I kind of have a point there. No, I'm just kidding. The last question that I have for you, or no, I'm going to pull you for two. One is there a part of us that desires reality? In these models where we have 0% chance of seeing reality, is there this common thread that is just there, that is inextinguishable, even though everything else goes extinct, that wants to see reality?
I think so. I personally feel that. And in the theory of consciousness that I'm developing, my proposal right now, the best proposal I've got for why there's a dynamics of consciousness at all, is that consciousness is always exploring new possibilities for conscious experiences, exploring new realities of conscious experiences. And there's something called Gödel's incompleteness theorem that I argue means that this exploration process will never end. It's intrinsically not going to stop, and that's what consciousness is about. If you were to ask me, what is consciousness about? What is it doing? The best answer I've got right now, which doesn't mean it's right, it's just the best answer I've got right now, is it's exploring all the possibilities of consciousness. And Gödel's theorem entails that exploration has always only just begun, and it will always only have just begun.
Well, are you familiar with Dr. Philip Clayton at all? He's a dual PhD at Yale, philosophy and science, philosophy and theology, and he was on the podcast just recently and talked about Western spirituality has been consumed with the exterior infinitude, the God beyond us, beyond this realm, and Eastern philosophy is oriented around the interior infinitude,
right?
Going within, going deeper, and it seems to jive well with that of it is never ending. The further we see and perceive in the universe, even in this space-time version, it is never ending. And from the micro quantum side of things, it is, you think an atom is the end of the story, and then it's neutrons and then neutrinos and quarks and never ending as well.
I would agree that it's an endless exploration, and it's both exhilarating and terrifying. It's exhilarating because you're learning new stuff, but it's terrifying because you have to let go of what you think you know.
Right.
Going into the unknown can be terrifying. People who meditate know that if you actually go into silence, it's not all goodness and light. It's scary. If you really let go of all thoughts, you're letting go of all your teddy bears and comfort blankets. So
right. Amen. It's not the experience you want, but the one that you need, as they say. And speaking of, after 2 hours of conversation, I feel like we've gone past any chapter of the book that I've ever gone past, and then still end with feeling like, okay, this isn't even the introduction to the book. This is the first 3 words. Like we're starting from scratch
here. Yes.
Right. The last question, Dr. Hoffman, where can people find out more about you and your work online?
Well, the book, The Case Against Reality, is a good place to find out about.
Excellent place. Yes.
And if people want to, I have a Twitter feed where I put the links to. I'll put a link to this conversation but all conversations, and to some of my papers. So it's at Donald D. Hoffman. Is the Twitter link if people want.
Awesome.
And if you just Google Donald Hoffman and University of California, Irvine, you can go to my webpage, and I've got a link to my Vita that has all of my publications on it with links to copies. So people, probably the easiest way, if you want to see my actual papers and read these scientific papers, just go to Google Scholar, type in my name.
Okay.
And
we'll put those links. We'll put the links in the show notes. Well, Dr. Hoffman, thank you so much for this incredibly elucidating conversation. But like I said, now I just feel like I need to toss out the old book and I'm starting from scratch with a brand new one. But thank you so much for the time and generosity and insight.
Thank you so much, James. It's a great pleasure to talk with you.
This was awesome. Thank you.